There are various ways in which power can be lost, but the death of King Philip II of Spain is among the most horrible examples. For a man who once ruled over half of the known world, his ultimate adversary turned out to be neither competing kings nor rebellious subjects, but rather something much more insidious: his own deteriorating flesh. As we make our way through the shadowy passageways of the Escorial Palace in the summer of 1598, you should get ready for a story in which total power collides with extreme vulnerability, in which the powerful are reduced to rotting prey, and in which nature delivers its most ruthless verdict on the hubris of kings. It is said that Philip II of Spain was the most powerful monarch of his day. He was the ruler of the first worldwide empire and the lord of lands that extended from the Americas to the Philippines, which still hold his name today. His power extended across continents, earning him the legendary boast that in his domain, the sun never sets. Philip was the son of Emperor Charles V, and his dominions spread across the globe. During the Counter-Reformation, he was renowned and feared for his role as a protector of Catholic orthodoxy. He was responsible for launching his powerful armada against England and supporting brutal battles against Protestant heretics across Europe. Philip's final struggle, however, would not take place on foreign battlefields, but rather within the confines of his own bedchamber, despite the fact that he held a great deal of control in the world. The monarch, who had led armies and navies, would be unable to move for a period of 52 days during the blazing summer in Spain. He would be locked in his own putrefying body as animals that were infinitesimally smaller than the smallest of his subjects consumed him alive. This is not merely a story about physical misery, despite the fact that the anguish was significant. Rather, it is a contemplation on the boundaries of human power, the inevitability of death, and the merciless democracy of decay. It was true that the Escorial Palace, which Philip had commissioned to serve as both a royal house and a mausoleum, would eventually become his tomb. However, this would not occur until after it had been used as the stage for his protracted and excruciating final performance. Within these stone walls, a king who was accustomed to determining the fate of nations would find himself completely helpless in the face of the unrelenting assault of sickness and parasites. The reports that those who were present during his final days left behind were so upsetting that historians for a long time believed that they were exaggerations. It appears from contemporary medical analysis that they were not. What follows is the actual account of the dreadful demise of Philip II, a death that was so drawn out, so terrible, and so demeaning that it serves as a memory mori for all time, reminding us that in the end, even monarchs return to dust, sometimes while still drawing breath, sometimes by inches, and sometimes as live feasts for the lowest creatures of creation. We are reminded of this fact as we peel back the beautiful royal bed sheets to discover the rotting form that lies underneath them. The spring of 1598 was the time when the first indications of Philip's terminal deterioration were apparent. Considering that he had spent decades battling a variety of illnesses, the king was already considered to be an elderly person by the norms of his time. He was 71 years old. Since he was in his 30s, he had been suffering from gout, which caused his fingers and toes to stretch into twisted appendages that made the processes of writing and walking got increasingly challenging. His knees, wrists, and shoulders were all affected by the attacks, which began in his extremities and progressed to become more frequent and severe with each passing year. In addition, Philip had developed a form of arthritis that was so severe that courtiers characterized him as being unable to move his hands or feet, and he was even unwilling to leave his head alone. By 1591, the king was already confined to a wheelchair as a result of these ailments, which included fevers that persisted throughout the year. Despite this, he continued to uphold his famed work ethic by personally reading each and every significant state document. He would sometimes annotate these documents with the straightforward order, "No." A single word could easily affect the destiny of thousands of people across his vast empire. On the other hand, Philip's condition made a significant deterioration in June of 1598. He was rendered disoriented and feeble as a result of a fresh round of fevers. Furthermore, A number of abscesses started to form on his right knee and hand, which is a cause for concern. Eventually, these pustules would burst and drain, only to reappear with a greater degree of ferocity. Even though court physicians used poultices and ordered bloodletting, the infection continued to spread unabated. This was due to the fact that the medical expertise available at the time was restricted. Within a matter of weeks, the King of Spain was confined to bed and left with just the ability to move his left arm and head. When it came to his physiological functions, the most powerful ruler in Christendom discovered that he was completely reliant on various attendants. Despite the fact that he had constructed the most formal court in Europe, his proud Spanish etiquette fell apart when confronted with the most fundamental of human needs. When the attendants were unable to change his bedding in a timely manner, the guy who had previously been approached solely with elaborate genuflection now lay dirty in his own excrement. The intensity of Philip's agony increased in tandem with the heat of July. He had an increase in the number of abscesses, which spread to his breast, groin, and legs. The vile odor that emanated from these suffocating wounds was so overpowering that even the most faithful attendants had a difficult time staying in the royal chamber longer than necessary. As the scent of rotting flesh pervaded the corridors of the palace, courtiers were forced to press perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses as they moved closer to the king's rooms. Even though Philip was still conscious enough to comprehend his predicament, he gave the order for the windows to be kept closed. This was not for his own comfort, but rather to keep the royal odor from disturbing those who were outside. There were contemporary stories that portrayed the body of the monarch as being covered with pustules that would rupture and then refill with blood and substance respectively. These wounds never fully healed and instead served as a breeding environment for something much more serious. As the king lay motionless, unable to move from his position without enduring agonizing pain, the bedding that was soaked in sweat offered the ideal condition for the infestation to take place. During the beginning of August, the first lice appeared. There is a possibility that they arrived with one of the palace attendants, or that they emerged from the bedding that was becoming progressively putrid. In spite of the fact that they came from somewhere else, they discovered that Philip's body was the perfect host for them because it was warm, moist, and unable to defend itself. The parasites reproduced at a rapid rate, feeding on the blood of the monarch as well as the plentiful dead tissue that was caused by his sores. Soon after, witnesses announced that, no matter how frequently the attendants attempted to keep the king's body clean, they were unable to do so since the king was covered in such a thick layer of lice. It was later written by Diego Depe, who was Philip's confessor, that the lice thrived within the wounds themselves, erupting from the putrefying flesh of the king. The result was the same regardless of whether this was true in a literal sense or simply appeared to be so to frightened observers. The most powerful man in Europe had become a live colony of parasites. According to some reports, trained attendants were given the sole responsibility of performing the chore of eradicating lice from the royal body. They collected the lice by the handfuls, only to discover new swarms of lice several hours later. The lice, however, were nothing more than opportunistic feeders. The genuine horror lay deeper within Philip's body, which was deteriorating. According to the documentation provided by the royal physician Andres Zamudio de Alfaro, the wounds of the monarch began to grow rotten and corrupt materials, which resulted in the development of a large number of maggots. These larvae, which were most likely of common flies that had entered the palace through the windows or doors, had made their way into the open sores of the king and had began to feed on the decaying tissue of the king. Imagine the scene. A man who was once considered to be on the verge of divinity, whose mere touch was believed by some to heal scrofula, now watched as worms writhed beneath his skin and emerged from his wounds. On a daily basis, the servants would remove the maggots, only to discover that there were fresh ones again the next morning. At the end of August, fresh atrocities appeared. It is said that Philip, who was fully cognizant and increasingly dependent on his Catholic religion for solace, made the following remark: "Lord, how greatly these offenses against you weigh upon me. though it pleases me to think how small they are compared to my sins. Massive bed sores had developed on his right hip and lower back as a result of the persistent pressure that was being applied to his immobilized body. These pressure ulcers, which were made worse by his inability to move and the constant moisture of his bedding, gradually wore through his skin, fat, and muscle, exposing his bone. In accordance with the royal chronicler C. Dieter, one of the ulcers that was located on his right hip had grown to such a size that it was possible to see into the internal cavity of his body. This horrific wound, which was described as being equivalent to the size of a fist, created its very own macabre ecology. Fray José de Sigüenza, who documented the closing days of the king's life, stated that from this wound alone, attendants withdrew material sufficient to fill 2 silver basins on a daily basis. The fact that this enormous lesion turned out to be the principal breeding habitat for maggots, which proliferated at a rate that was faster than they could be removed, is even more worrisome. According to some contemporary stories, the larvae would burrow deeper into the ground whenever they were disturbed, and they would practically consume the king from the inside out. In addition to laying their eggs in dead tissue, the flies that were drawn to the wounds of the monarch began to infest Philip's mouth, nose, and ears as his health worsened. This was because the flies were eager to lay their eggs in dead tissue. The once feared monarch was unable to remove the insects from his face, so he had no choice but to suffer through them crawling across his face and into his orifices. Some historians are of the opinion that Philip may have suffered from myiasis, which is a disorder in which the Larrae virus attacked living tissue in a number of different locations across his body. This list of pain was further compounded by the fact that the king's gout was getting worse, which made it excruciating for him to be touched in any way, even if it was just a little bit. On the other hand, if the caregivers attempted to adjust his posture or remove soiled bedding, his body had to be repositioned and cleaned. The screams of Philip reverberated throughout the halls of the palace. The monarch, who had formerly stood by and watched in awe as heretics were burned at Auto Daves, now begged for forgiveness from his own attendants. Philip's thinking stayed basically intact for the entirety of this incomprehensible ordeal. It was possible that this lucidity was the cruelest part of his degradation. He was fully aware of his change from a ruler to a mere shadow of a king. The monarch who had constructed the majestic Escorial as a testimony to Spanish glory and his own legacy now lay decaying within its walls, cognizant of each new indignity perpetrated upon his deteriorating flesh. He had built the Escorial as a testament to both glory and his own legacy. Even though he was in excruciating pain, Philip was able to keep a surprising level of serenity for issues of the spirit. The reading of religious books was something that he frequently requested, and he also requested that daily mass be performed in his apartments. Even as his body turned into a theater of horrors, the man who had been a champion of Catholic orthodoxy across Europe remained unwavering in his commitment to his faith. In the intervals between episodes of anguish, he would engage in conversations with his son and heir, the future Philip III, about matters of state and the future of his enormous kingdom. By the beginning of September, the king's misery was worsened by new symptoms. He was further debilitated by persistent diarrhea, which may have been caused by an intestinal infection or as a side effect of his therapies. This added to the dirt that was surrounding him throughout his life. The failure of his kidneys led to a significant increase in the amount of swelling in his legs and belly, which was referred to as edema. His already damaged skin was stretched to its breaking point as a result of this fluid retention, which resulted in fresh ruptures that supplied additional entrance points for infection and infestation. According to the documentation provided by Garcia de Tay, the court physician, the king acquired a high fever along with delirium, which most likely indicated that sepsis had set in. During the times when he was more conscious, Philip reportedly made repeated requests for a certain crucifix. It was the same crucifix that his father, Emperor Charles V, had held as he passed away. Despite the fact that Philip's actual bodily sovereignty was disintegrating into disorder and corruption, this symbolic tie to his imperial history appeared to be a source of consolation. There is a high probability that the remedies that were administered by royal physicians did not alleviate the king's suffering, but rather contributed to it. In accordance with the humoral hypothesis, the medical professionals applied caustic substances to his wounds in an effort to restore the equilibrium of his physiological fluids. Because of the presence of these chemicals, which included arsenic compounds and mercury preparations, his already weakened tissues would have been burned, which could have expedited the process of necrosis. At a time when the monarch was in critical need of his strength, the frequent bloodletting, which sometimes occurred on a daily basis, also further debilitated him. The majority of Philip's diet during these final weeks consisted of broths, watered wine, and soft bread, which he consumed when he was able to consume food nonetheless. In any case, the confluence of factors, including infection, parasitic infestation, blood loss as a result of medical procedures, and inadequate nutrition, provided the ideal conditions for his body to completely collapse. Palpitations and spells of shortness of breath were only two of the symptoms that the king reported experiencing as his heart began to show signs of arrhythmia. His heart was struggling against the growing systemic failure. When it came to Philip, even the weather worked against him. Within the walls of the Escorial, which were made of stone, heat was trapped like an oven during the summer of 1598, which was an extraordinarily hot season in central Spain. As a result of this elevated temperature, the reproductive cycles of the lice and flies that were tormenting the monarch were accelerated, and the degradation of his damaged flesh might be accelerated as well. There was very little breeze that could cool his fever-racked body or disperse the miasma of decay that hung like a pall over the royal bed, since the few windows in his chamber were kept partially closed to contain the stink. By the second week of September, it was quite evident that the conclusion was drawing near. In spite of the enormous amount of pain he was experiencing, Philip remained awake and made a request for his children to have his blessing. In spite of the fact that he had been mostly shielded from witnessing the worst of his father's decline, his son, who would later become Philip III, was plainly astonished by the altered person that stood in front of him. As a result of being overpowered by the sight and smell of his formerly formidable father, who had been reduced to a writhing, infested shell, the young prince was allegedly forced to leave the room multiple times in order to give himself time to recover himself. As a final example of his kingly duties, Philip made an effort to pass on his knowledge to his successor. Witnesses claim that he cautioned his son about the transient nature of earthly power, attempting to demonstrate his point by weakly pointing to his own ruined body as evidence. According to reports, he informed the prince, "I have been treated like an old dog." It is not clear if these statements were intended to serve as a warning against pride or as a painful admission of his rejection by courtiers who could no longer stand his presence. "Remember this when you wear the crown," he said. In the year 1598, on September 13th, Philip made a request for the final sacraments. Extreme unction was provided by his confessor, who anointed the few parts of the king's body that could still be touched without causing him to scream out in anguish. The smell of putrefaction, which could not be covered up by any quantity of incense, continued to attract flies to the holy oil despite the fact that spectators observed this phenomenon throughout the entire ritual. The symbols of divine grace could be seen mingling with the evidence of mortal degradation in a macabre scenario that would have thrilled even the most passionate Vanitas painter. A cascade of systemic failures culminated in the king's final hours, which were marked by increased respiratory distress as fluid filled his lungs. This was the final insult in the chain of failed systems. His respiration grew difficult and rattling, and each exhale carried the putrid odor of decaying organs or tissues within his body. Philip II of Spain took his last breath at 5 o'clock in the morning on September 13th, after he had requested that the cross be put on his breast. In the end, the most little of foes were successful in capturing the ruler who had commanded the wealth of the New World and the power of Europe's strongest army. The preparation of the royal body offered difficulties that had never been seen before. Considering the advanced level of decomposition, the traditional embalming processes proved to be extremely difficult to perform. According to the documents filed with the court, the body was in such a degraded state that it began to disintegrate when it was relocated. To make the remains acceptable for lying in state, the royal embalmers worked rapidly and used enormous quantities of perfumes, spices, and preservative chemicals. They did this in an effort to make the remains seem their best. Even though these efforts were made, the king's physique continued to deteriorate at a rapid rate. As a result, the burial services were shortened, and only the most fundamental rites were carried out before the sealed casket was transported to the royal crypt that was located beneath the Escorial. Philip was eventually able to conceal his bodily deterioration from view, if not from memory or history, when he was laid to rest there with his father and his numerous wives. A variety of reactions were elicited across Europe as the news of the king's tragic death immediately circulated around the continent. In Protestant England and the Netherlands, where Philip had been regarded as a dictator and persecutor, news of his suffering were welcomed with hardly hidden joy. This was the case in each of these countries. There were pamphlets that circulated that indicated that his horrible death was divine punishment for the tortures carried out by the Inquisition and the murder that occurred during the Dutch Revolt. It is said that Queen Elizabeth I of England, who had been Philip's adversary for a long time, made the following remark upon hearing the details: "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." Official accounts of Philip's death were sanitized in Catholic territories, particularly in Spain itself, with an emphasis on his piety and dignity in facing his final trial. In court chronicles, the more unpleasant elements were left out, and instead, the emphasis was placed on his receipt of the sacraments and his concern for the succession. Those who lived in Spain were informed that their monarch had passed away in the same manner in which he had lived, as a pillar of Catholic virtue and royal fortitude. Physicians and historians of medicine now believe that Philip suffered from a number of different diseases. His gout, which had been present for a long time, had most likely progressed into a sort of rheumatoid arthritis, which had a negative impact on his immune system. This, in conjunction with the fact that he was suffering from diabetes, as evidenced by his symptoms of exorbitant thirst and swelling, established the ideal conditions for the development of various infections. On the other hand, his immobility led to the development of stage 4 pressure ulcers, which gave entrance points for maggot infestation. It is possible that a systemic staphylococcal infection was the specific cause of his pustules and abscesses. What makes Philip's situation particularly noteworthy is not just the magnitude of his physical agony, but also the manner in which it served as a grotesque inversion of his authority on earth. It was impossible for the king, who had previously ordered thousands of soldiers to lose their lives in combat, to order the insects to leave his bodily flesh. Even while his words could condemn heretics to fire, the monarch was unable to prevent his own body from becoming a breeding ground for vermin. In a later piece of writing, historian William H. Prescott stated that no amount of power or wealth could purchase escape from the grave. This phrase refers to the opportunity to be exempt from the physical laws that govern all mortality. The death of Philip is more than simply a horrible historical footnote. It is also a potent memento mori, a reminder that power, regardless of how absolute it may be, does not provide immunity against the fundamental vulnerabilities that are inherent to the human condition. His demise exemplified the most fundamental democratic principle, which states that all people, regardless of their social standing, must endure the humiliation of physical deterioration. The only difference is that Philip's prominence ensured that his pain would be meticulously documented and remembered centuries after it had occurred. Observers of the time were aware of the irony that was associated with his passing. Throughout his life, Philip had spent decades fighting battles in order to maintain the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church and the divine prerogative of kings. The individual had positioned himself as the tool that God had decided to use on earth, the one who would defend genuine religion against heresy. However, it seems that there was no divine intervention or miraculous preservation of the royal corpse occurred during his dying days. Instead, the most Catholic king endured a death that appeared to be more of a punishment than a reward. It was as though the very God whose cause he had championed had abandoned him. Once Philip passed away, The Spanish Empire entered a period of gradual decline that would last for a very long time. In terms of work ethic and administrative ability, his son, Philip III, did not inherit his father's qualities. Spain would eventually relinquish its status as the preeminent power in Europe through the gradual loss of lands and influence that would occur over the course of several decades. It has been believed by a number of historians that the young Philip's unwillingness to fully engage with the responsibilities of kingship was influenced by the trauma of seeing the death of his father. Instead, Philip preferred to delegate power to his favorites while chasing pleasure. Escorial Palace, which Philip II had envisioned as the seat of worldwide power and a monument to Spanish greatness, would never again function as the effective command center of a globe empire. This was a significant change from Philip II's original concept. Instead, it would gradually develop into a great temple, which was something that its architecture had always promised it could become. Even if they hear sanitized versions of his death that stress on his piety rather than his physical degradation, tourists are able to see the royal apartments where Philip experienced his terrible end, despite the fact that they cannot see the rooms themselves. The manner in which Philip's tragic death has influenced our historical imagination is possible to be the most permanent legacy that it has left behind. The fact that he passed away serves as a potent reminder that the gap between the heights of human strength and the depths of human vulnerability is not as great as we may prefer to believe it to be. In his closing days, the monarch who ruled half of the world came to the realization that he was unable to control the processes that occurred within his own body. This is a lesson that is just as applicable to contemporary leaders as it was in the 16th century. For all of his geographical conquests and political maneuverings, Philip II is arguably most vividly remembered today for the manner in which he left this world. Not in glory on the battlefield, nor in tranquil sleep surrounded by loving family, but rather in a prolonged nightmare of corruption and consumption was the manner in which he passed away. His narrative serves as a reminder that the circumstances surrounding a person's death frequently influence the judgments that history makes. In many cases, judgment is not based on how we use power, but rather on how we deal with the loss of power that is unavoidable. The transition from the most powerful monarch of his time to food for worms occurred not after death, as it does for everyone else, but while he was still alive, still thinking, and still experiencing each bite. This dark journey through the final days of Philip II may prompt us to reflect on the words that are said to have been discovered among his private papers after his death. These words are said, to have been and not to be is not to be at all. For a king who was obsessed with legacy and remembrance, it is a bitter irony that he is remembered not for the empire he built, but for the grotesque spectacle of his disintegration. It is a visceral reminder that power is always fleeting, that glory always fades, and that in the end, nature renders everyone equal, kings and commoners alike, returning to dust, sometimes inch by torturous inch. His death has outlived his successes in our collective consciousness, and it serves as a reminder that his death has outlived his triumphs.